I'm going to show you how to stretch watercolour paper. Stretching watercolour paper helps keep the paper flat throughout the whole painting process and leaves you with a finished painting on a lovely, smooth, flat piece of paper. If you don't stretch watercolour paper, what happens is that certain areas of the paper will become more saturated with water than others and will expand and then contract at a different rate. And it leaves you with a sheet of paper that has buckling or an undulating surface. So by stretching watercolour paper, you're saturating the whole sheet with the same amount of water, fixing it to a board with Gumstrip and keeping it nice and taut so it makes sure that this buckling doesn't happen. You'll need a tray of water, clean tray, clean water, and what you need to make sure is that the longest edge of your tub will accommodate the shortest edge of your watercolour paper so that you can slide the paper through the water easily. If you don't have any vessel that's quite that size, you can make do with a spray bottle that you can spray and saturate the water with a spray bottle instead. You obviously need a sheet of watercolour paper and it can be of any weight. And the board that you're going to stretch your watercolour paper to needs to be just a little bit bigger than the sheet of paper. This is plywood board, which is ideal because it has a degree of absorbency. You can use plastic, but I find that plywood board is ideal. You'll also need a couple of sponges. Here we've got some natural sea sponges, but they don't need to be natural sea sponges. They could be synthetic sponges. So long as they're free of any soap, detergent, they'll be fine to use. And finally, Gumstrip tape. So this is a brown tape. It's not sticky when it's dry, but when you wet it, it activates the glue. And this is going to hold your paper in place on its board. Before you start, I think it's a really good idea to cut your gum strips to the right length. Here's the tape. The gum strip's really easy to tear, and conveniently enough, this board is just the right size, but about 3 centimeters longer than the sheet of paper. I'm just going to hold it against the board and tear my length. It's really important when you soak your paper that it is completely saturated with water. It's not just wet, but the very fibres of the paper have absorbed some water. So 140 pound weight paper, as we're using today, may need up to 8 minutes of soaking in water. And if you have a tub like I do here, it would just be a process of feeding the paper through the water multiple times until it really feels properly saturated. We're just going to try and hold it by the edges and feed it through the tub. So the paper, quite often it has external sizing, which helps with the resistance of the paint. So the paint doesn't just sink into the fibres of the paper. So this process will wash some of that sizing away. And different brands of paper will have different amounts of sizing. And then I've got it from both sides and I've got it in a U shape. And I'm just going to find the sort of approximate middle of the board. And you want to try and get the same gap around the piece of paper on your board, just roughly. And you can use a sponge. If you dip it in a bit of water and wring it out, and then just smooth it down onto the board with an outward motion. And just remember, this sponge needs to be completely clean and free of any soap, which could actually break down the sizing on the paper. And now we're going to put the gum strip on. So you need to wet the gum strip, but it needs to not be soaking. And if you're going to stretch multiple sheets of paper, probably best not to use a tray of water. So I've got a separate jar of water that's going to be for my gum strip. And I'm going to use another sponge, and this is going to be my clean sponge. Make sure you keep them separate because you don't want the gum from the gum strip going onto the surface of your paper. So I'm just going to soak it in my jar And rather than immerse the strips of Gumstrip into the jar of water, I'm just going to rub the sponge over the strip. That's got it damp enough. And I'm going to then tape it with about just under 1 centimetre over the paper, with the rest of the tape hanging over onto the board, and just smoothing it down with the sponge. Go over the edge like so. Just notice that I'm not going over onto the sheet of paper. You've got to make sure that you avoid doing that. You want to not get your tape too wet, because then the glue washes away. My saturated paper, which is in its fully expanded state, is now taut and taped against the board, and you now leave this to dry, and it's probably best to leave it overnight. Just make sure it's properly dry, and in that drying process the paper will contract again. That moisture will either sink into the board or evaporate, and there'll be a tension that's supported by this gum strip, and then that will keep it nice and flat for when you're painting. If you wanted to use a hairdryer to speed the process, you could, but personally I like to let the paper dry naturally, just to ensure that the whole surface loses its moisture at the same rate and it keeps everything nice and even. You do your painting flat on the board as it is, and then when the painting is completely dry, again, let that happen, let it dry completely, and then you can cut it away from the gum stripped edges using a sharp scalpel or craft knife. If you want to keep the deckled edges of a sheet of handmade paper that you've stretched, unfortunately this process probably isn't the right thing to use, because the gum strip is not re-wettable, so it's very hard to remove it from the sheet of paper once you've stretched it using gum strip. You could try using staples, in fact, to keep the deckled edge and just carefully remove the staples, or you can just fake it and get a faux deckled edge to your paper by removing it with a craft knife first of all, and then lightly tearing the edges against a metal ruler. So I'm just going to start painting. So you'll notice that the paper is getting really wet now. I'm really not holding back in terms of applying the water to the paper, just getting those initial colours in. Because this paper is still a little bit wet, it's going to bleed a little bit, but I quite like that slightly feathery effect. So while you're painting, it's quite normal to see the paper buckle up again, but it will be at a much less degree in comparison to if you hadn't stretched the paper at all. But rest assured, once the painting dries again, the paper will flatten out. So I have my finished painting here, and I'm ready to take it from the board. It's left it to dry, completely dry now. So what I'm going to do is, because I put the tape on by eye, it's not covering the same amount of the paper consistently across the whole sheet. You're better off looking at the outline of the sheet of paper, which you can see through the gum strip. And what I'm going to do is just hold the metal ruler against that line that I can see, the edge of the paper, and then use that to rest my scalpel against as I cut through the gum strip. Yes. So my paper is now free from the board. You're left with your board. It's got the gum strip all around it, and you'll probably want to remove this gum strip before you use it again to stretch more paper. What I would do is get a sponge and just saturate that gum strip, and then some of it might peel away. Let's have a look. Peels away a little bit more easily when it's wet, but if you get scourer, you can just finish the job off scrubbing away. So that's how you stretch watercolour paper. Just to recap, It's really important that you have clean water. Soak the paper generously so that it's properly immersed in that water before you apply it to a plywood board. And just make sure that the glue of the gum strip doesn't touch the surface of the paper, as that could affect how the paper behaves when you start painting on it. And just make sure that you allow sufficient time for the paper to dry before you start painting. I hope you enjoy your watercolour painting experience.